Okay, Ashish. So, you are the founder of Kalpavriksh, an environmental action organization, and we have invited you to Kassel to speak about post-development and alternatives to development. So, could you maybe briefly tell us alternatives to what?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think if you see the kind of problems that development has caused across the world, but especially the global south, um, we're talking about ecological destruction, inequality, social disruption, alienation from the rest of nature, alienation from ourselves, from each other. Um, if you want to talk about alternatives to this, we need to go a little bit deeper into the roots of the crisis, all these different crises that we're facing. So this is really about looking at the sort of domination or the concentration of power in the hands of a few vis-a-vis the rest, which could be corporations under capitalism, men in patriarchal systems, the nation state in statism, ethnicities, racism, etc., and of course human beings vis-a-vis the rest of nature. So alternatives to these structures of oppression and unsustainability and injustice is what we're talking about.
Okay, so if you say these problems are being caused by development, what exactly are you then referring to? To these structures of oppression? To
Yes,
patriarchal capitalism, etc., etc.?
yes, but and their manifestations. So the manifestations are, for instance, extractivism as a practice and as an ideology. That for any country to develop, they have to have there has to be extractivist industry, which could be mining, oil, commercial agriculture. So basically, any which way you can extract value, profit from nature, and from those who are laboring on nature and natural resources. That form of extractivism then is a sort of a reflection of these deeper rooted structural problems, and then the consequences of that. So that's one example, but there are many others.
Okay. So what would you answer to someone who told you, yeah, well, but what you're talking about is not development, this is very destructive, and development is defined as human development and as enlarging people's choices. Amartya Sen has coined the phrase, development should be conceptualized as freedom. So what would you answer to those people telling you, though, no, development is different, development is something very positive?
Well, that's nice and abstract and nice theory. But if you look at it across the world, except for Bhutan, every country in the world defines development in terms of growth rates, economic growth rates, GDP, right? So it's fine to say freedoms and it's fine to say developing human capacity and all of that. And in fact, the origin of the word development in that sense is the opposite of envelopment. So it's about opening up, right? But in these last 50, 60 years, it has essentially meant economic growth, and economic growth at any cost. So every country says 5%, 6%, 10%. Even in the sustainable development goals, economic growth is one of those goals. And so it's okay to say that, but in actuality, development has come to mean exactly any which way in which you can do economic growth, which is extractivism and so on and so forth. Okay. And the second crucial issue there is it's created this division between the developed and the underdeveloped or the developing. And it's like a unilinear vision that everybody, if they have to be developed, they have to be in that European or American model of what development means. And so this division has been created, which is enormously problematic because it seems to suggest that, for instance, countries like India or Bangladesh or Kenya or anywhere in the global south, they are in some way they're kind of primitive. They're like outmoded. They're behind. They have to follow the model that the West has set. And that is so complicated, that's so seriously problematic because it ignores the fact that we have our own knowledge systems, we have our own ways of thinking about what well-being and happiness is, and we all have our own histories of living with nature and living with each other, which are completely ignored in this mad rush towards one model of what is called development.
Okay. Other critics might say, well, if you're talking about economic growth, and its destructive consequences in terms of ecology, exploitation, etc., etc. This is not what we envision. We envision a socialist development where there is no accumulation, where there's no economic growth, etc., and where industry and technology serve the needs of the people. What about that?
Well, I mean, at least all the experience so far of so-called socialist development has not shown that the economic model is any different. The only thing that is different, and of course that's a significant difference, is who owns the means of production. So instead of private capitalists, it would be owned by the state, right? But you'd still have the same kind of extractivist mindset. I mean, you take all the so-called revolutionary governments in Latin America or Greece or anywhere, and they have socialized the economy. They have made it public enterprise and so on, or even India in the first 25, 30 years after independence. But it was still about going and doing mining. It was still about oil exploration. It was still about big hydroelectricity projects and so on. It was still about chemical agriculture. It wasn't really about how does one empower people on the ground, and that's what real democracy is about, to try and determine their own futures and work with each other in ways that that kind of emphasize and build on their own knowledge systems. And plus you can add, of course, knowledge systems from outside, but not this kind of imposition of this one single economic model. And so you can't have socialism cannot simply be about the politics of who owns what. It's also about how you treat nature and how you treat each other and what your visions of a good living are. And there I don't see a significant difference between capitalism and state socialism.
Okay. Now you wonderfully anticipated my final question, and this is referring to a debate we had in the panels and also in some journal articles and books, because the post-development critique started out by saying, look, you Eurocentric development experts, you are actually imposing a certain model of what a good society should be constituted of to the rest of the world. Now this is obviously full of relations of power, colonial relations of power, etc. Now, some critics of the post-development school have argued, yeah, but you're actually basically doing the same if you are then preaching the virtues of frugality and of a vernacular society. And this again points to the fact that you already mentioned, that the point in rejecting all these relations of power should be a democratic debate on how a good life, living well, should look like. Now you have, with the Vikalp Sangam process, initiated precisely such a debate among marginalized peoples in India during the past years, since 2014, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
Where people were given the opportunity to reflect on precisely these questions. Mm-hmm. Now, could you maybe briefly tell us about the results?
Well, I mean, the idea is that people are struggling on the ground, both in terms of resisting this dominant mode of development and political governance and so on, but also creating for themselves practical, on the ground, grassroots options for good living. And for meeting basic needs and meeting aspirations. And the idea for the Vikalp Sangam was that how do you get these together across different sectors, across the resistances and the alternatives, different kinds of people, different kinds of experiences, and learn from each other, work with each other, and build a common vision of what an alternative India could look like, right? And it's not as if it's one model. And that's a crucial difference, that instead of this homogenizing, hegemonic development discourse, which is like this one model everybody has to follow, we shouldn't be making the mistake that there is one alternative model. There's a pluriverse of ideas and ways of doing things, but perhaps with some common thread of common values, that you do things in ways that respect other people's lives or respect other species. You do things in ways that the collective is being put at the center rather than this individualized selfishness, but also, of course, individual identity is respected. You do things in ways where, so you mentioned simplicity and frugality. Now, this can be interpreted in so many different ways in so many societies. What is simplicity for me may be very different from you. But the basic idea that I'm not running after more and more and more material possessions, that I am after a point happy with what I am and satisfied, and want more good social relationships rather than more material possessions. That basic idea could be running across lots of different cultures, no? Or for instance, the idea that my language is as important as your language, or my way of thinking is as important as your way of thinking, but that I respect yours and you respect mine, in which case we build a coexistence rather than I hate you and you hate me. You know? So I think all of these things come in the Vikalp Sangam process, and we try and emphasize both the practical collaborations that could take this further and make it a more critical mass, but also the visioning and the dreaming and the collective sort of, what should I say, uh, conceptual frameworks that could bring us together and confront the dominant systems.
Okay. Thank you, Ashish.
Thank you.